Hey, and welcome back to the Docs Who Live podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Spencer. I got my co-host, of course, the great Dr. Karl Nadolsky
Ahoy, hoy.
Jr. With us today, we got a couple of special guests. They're in the same square using the same computer, but they're from Johns Hopkins, so we're going to allow it. Dr. Jackie Yao, she's a postdoc research fellow uh, working with Dr. Blaha, who's on here as well from the Johns Hopkins. And today we're going to be talking about a little paper that came out, it's like a week or so ago, that caught our eye on the old tweeters, now called X, that looks in, and I believe this is the first, and they say it actually in the paper, but I'm pretty sure this is the first time they've actually looked at the overlap or the prevalence of what we've talked about before, this new Lancet Commission talking about that clinical obesity versus the anthropomorphic or BMI-defined obesity in a large adult cohort study. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Yao and Dr. Blaha.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, so, okay. Casey, what do you want to ask any first questions
Well,
to get going? You want to?
Yeah, I guess, first of all, neither one of you were involved in the Lancet Commission, correct?
Yeah,
correct. Okay. So, I was privy to this as we have been working on the American Association of Clinical Endocrinology's updated algorithm, kind of a guideline thing for obesity. And we've long been trying to talk about obesity beyond BMI, and essentially what they kind of tried to do, the clinical component, our term is adiposity-based chronic disease, and staging the severity of obesity based upon obesity-related diseases or complications. So while we were doing that, of course, one of my co-chair, Dr. Tim Garvey, was part of the Lancet Commission, or at least one of the many, many, many people on that. And so he had real insight into their debates on all this stuff. And I found it very difficult. Of course, we were debating it while they were going through the whole process, right? And their ultimate definitions of complications versus like obesity related disease, and then how they truly stick to the criteria, I found somewhat difficult to reconcile, but we tried to do it, and that'll be published hopefully relatively soon, our guideline. But I'm very interested in how you looked at the bottom line for most people is that, you guys looked at BMI, you looked at waist circumference and waist to height and waist to hip to try to, have what we call an anthropometric criteria for obesity, excess adipose tissue, right? And then you guys looked at the Lancet Commission criteria that would define what they call clinical obesity as opposed to preclinical obesity compared to people without any anthropometric criteria. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I'll walk you back to kind of, how we came to this, and we can talk about some of the details. Yeah. So we, we're do epidemiology here in the preventive cardiology space, very interested in obesity. We have our own cardiometabolic clinic. So when this new definition came out, I think I got an advanced copy as to make a comment to a reporter. I was thinking about some of the same things that you were saying, like, well, this is an interesting definition. So of course, the first thing we thought of is, well, what are the implications of this? What's the epidemiology of this? So because one of the things that we were struck by in the definition is that hadn't been done yet. No one seemed to have the numbers yet, or how was this going to reclassify people according to the World Health Organization BMI definition? So that's right. So the first thing we did was we scoured this document, trying to understand it the best we can, and then tried to apply it. And those are two difficult tasks. And we could talk about the data set we used in a second, which is all of us, but it's even difficult to find a data set where you can really explore it thoroughly, because it has to be a clinical data set where you have these diagnoses. But anyway, so as epidemiologists, the first thing we wanted to know was, well, how much does this change? Is this the same thing repackaged, or is this a meaningful change? So anyway, that was the root. And we remember we're in our lab space right now. We were presenting this definition in our lab space. And we were all kind of looking at each other and saying, I think we need to do a study here. I think we need to figure out what the meaning of this is. Anyway, so that's the background of how we approach this. And Jackie, Dr. Yao, and I, and others here in the group launched this study.
So, how did you define the anthropomorphic or anthropometric obesity first? Because that's what people want to know. Like, just because I looks like I have excess adiposity, is it going to cause me harm? Or is it preclinical versus the clinical? What we kind of discussed before.
Yeah, I think that part for that part is already well documented or well consensus in the from the Lancet Commission. They already listed several measurements that you can refer to when talk about anthropometric measures, including waist circumference, waist to hip ratio, and waist to height ratio. Those the three main part if they have provided offered in the document, and that's what we try to follow closely in our problems paper. And also the Lancet Commission, they also proposed to use DAXA, which is an image tool to diagnose your fat content or fat distribution more carefully and more precisely if available. But the thing is, we are unfortunate it's not available in our current data set, so we couldn't do that part. But in our policy paper, we definitely used BMI and also the three anthropometric measurement I just mentioned above to define the obesity, to differentiate obesity from non-obesity. And the next stage will be, sorry to interrupt, but yeah, Carl, I think you hit a point. Like when we look at the definition, one painful thing there was how we reconcile that into real application. Like even we are looking at the document, we're very excited to see this coming out, and we did appreciate this definition. It's really carrying things forward, moving things to the next chapter. And I think they really did a great job. But I would say there is some nuance there that need more more polished statement or like a more nuanced way to think about how researcher or how clinical practitioners would see this and how we assess this patient with obesity and how to classify them into clinical obesity. So that was a big obstacle when we were trying to do this prevalence paper, which we believe, or at least to our knowledge, is the first one so far. And there's a couple of things that in the clinical obesity part that we need a little bit of modification or, just use your imagination sometime. For example, for the proposed to use elevated blood pressure as a separate condition that can be used to diagnose clinical obesity. But when Dr. Blaha and our group, when we were scrutinizing the data set, we found out that about 40 or 50% of people participant in this data set, they have elevated or once they have elevated blood pressure. But the thing is, we couldn't just simply categorize all those people into, clinical obesity. Plus, you are also in clinical practice, and you know that some people they maybe have some white coat syndrome, and they just have one time like blood pressure in office that elevated. We cannot just do that judgment so quickly and say because your BMI is above 35 or something and you have one time in office blood pressure elevation that we categorize you into clinical obesity. That and if to a bigger picture, if the clinical obesity would be something probably something popular or something that be adopted by other practitioners in the future, that will be definitely be a diagnosis that will be showing up in one's profile forever. So we cannot just simply say if because one time blood pressure, you will be categorized into that group. So for that part, we try to customize it more according to the already very recognized the metabolic syndrome condition. Like we pick like if you just have one condition from the metabolic part, you are just okay. You don't have to be necessarily to be categorized as clinical obesity. And that's one modification that we did. And also for other things, for example, for the physical limitation part, because that's a huge part from their clinical obesity definition. They said if a person has physical ability limitation, they should be categorized into clinical obesity. But how you really assess that? Obviously, we don't have that. We don't have that every day assessed in your clinic. Maybe we ask your patient, like, ask the patient, how's your physical activity overall? But we don't have the skill for that. And that's also obstacle that we encountered in our data set. So we eventually settled down of using a self-reported question asking what's your ability of carrying out your daily activity, like for most of the time or for a moderate time or for just for a little time, you were able to do that. So we based on that question to categorize clinical obesity. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we really have to customize the definition into real practice research.
Yeah. So I have some questions to follow up on that. This again goes back to the Lancet Commission criteria. I'm looking at, I'm literally looking at their table 2 where they had their essentially their Delphi consensus thing for these criteria. Now, so I mean, in my world, from the research that's been done that led to our guidance, when people debate metabolically healthy obesity, for example, and so you alluded to this, right? So yeah, one random high blood pressure shouldn't count, for anybody really anytime. We got to recheck it and confirm that that's a thing. But in a lot of the studies that suggest there are such things as the metabolically healthy obesity for BMI, when people use the whole, you have to have criteria for metabolic syndrome, like even number 10 on the Lancet Commission says the cluster of hyperglycemia, high triglycerides, and low HDL. Now that doesn't include the high blood pressure. That was its own thing on there. But any one of those technically is a very metabolically unhealthy obesity. It shouldn't require all of them. Any one of them on their own right would cause it. So then in the studies that look at, metabolically healthy obesity or not, if you delineate down and say, oh, well, they have dyslipidemia, they have high triglycerides, or they have low HDL, or they have prediabetes, that would count as certainly not healthy by any means. But you're saying even the blood pressure, just hypertension on its own, you guys didn't count due to the concern of one random one being included in it? Is that
Yes. Yeah. Lots of interesting analytical questions here. So amongst other things we could talk about, but this was certainly something we spent a lot of time talking about, which is that at first, when we were kind of running some data, it looked like just about I'm exaggerating, but it looked like just about everyone had clinical obesity. Very few people had preclinical obesity. And it was driven in what we looked to see what was that driven by. It was driven in large part by elevated blood pressure.
Yeah.
Because elevated blood pressure it's not even hypertension, it's elevated blood pressure. So we had to make a compromise there.
Yeah.
And this was something we have in the supplement. You might have noticed we have some sensitivity analyses where we don't do it this way, but we said you had to have at least one other metabolic abnormality, high trigs and a low HDL, or high blood pressure and a trigs or something more than just elevated blood pressure, or else the dominant driver of clinical obesity was simply blood pressure.
Right.
And the contribution of that long list that you mentioned was almost meaningless next to the blood pressure driving everything. So this was where we arrived at. And I certainly remember talking about this quite a bit in the analytical side.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay.
I was just going to say, just for anybody listening, just a reminder that preclinical obesity is basically having excess adiposity or fat tissue without having some harm,
any obesity related disease.
Well, any harm. So you can imagine people having this going in, getting nervous, getting their blood pressure elevated, and it's not really. I don't know. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So we're putting two together, two of the metabolic syndrome components.
And when you guys said that, it looked like almost everybody would have had clinical obesity, if we included just random high blood pressures. You're talking about anybody who first met the anthropometric criteria of the waist measurements or BMI, or just everyone across the board, like even people without any anthropometric criteria. Like not everyone had an elevated blood pressure, right, in the whole data set? You know what I'm saying?
Not everyone have,
Okay.
of course, not everyone have
So,
elevated blood
yeah.
pressure.
Okay.
So
I'm just
refers to
making
the definition of metabolic syndrome. Like if you go to their definition, you'll see how they define the metabolic dysfunction from different perspectives.
Yeah.
So we'll kind of refer to that.
So, Okay, so then I have two more questions just based on the criteria, and then I want you guys to describe, how this played out and what the results were. So I'm just looking at this darn Lancet criteria a little bit. And like I said, under metabolism, it has the cluster of hyperglycemia, high blood sugars, high triglycerides, low HDL. It doesn't have all by itself hyperglycemia, prediabetes, or type 2 diabetes, though. How did you guys reconcile that? Because obviously, prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, if it's, unless it's type 1 or some other rare type of diabetes, that is an obesity-related disease. But this gets into how the Lancet had this like nuanced, these nuanced definitions of complications, end organ damage versus obesity-related disease. Did you guys include just prediabetes, hyperglycemia by itself?
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of tricky part. But actually, in the metabolic part, we just included this with pre-diabetes. So we actually separated type 1 or type 2 diabetes. Actually, type 2 diabetes. I don't think type 1 diabetes is there in the list. If
No, I mean, well, no diabetes is in the list. It just says the cluster of hyperglycemia and high triglycerides. So that's why I want to make sure that if somebody has prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, it counts because that is a
it definitely
severe.
counts.
Okay, good. Just making sure. And then the other one it has under number 11 for liver, it has the old nomenclature, NAFLD, but it says with hepatic fibrosis. So I would argue, let's say in our ACE guidance, we would say that MASLD, metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, even without advanced fibrosis, would be an obesity-related disease and count as more severe disease or say clinical obesity from my perspective. But that's not exactly what the Lancet Commission says. And I don't even know if you guys had that data for your study, but
It's funny you're bringing this up. You're kind of giving me some flashbacks to the peer review
I'm
process
sure,
for the
yeah.
paper.
I can imagine because we were probably doing this at the same time.
But
Going,
this is exactly
having
the
these,
things we spent time talking about. Yeah. So one of the peer reviewers gave us a difficult time because yes, we used a clinical diagnosis of fatty liver disease or NAFLD, which was, what was in the chart before the MASLD really became the preferred terminology. But we didn't have evidence of fibrosis
right.
in the data. So
Okay.
we consider any of the MASLD, but this was something that a reviewer pushed back on. And one of the things that was interesting about this, I'm just speculating here, but I believe that at least one of the reviewers was from the commission.
Oh.
And we felt like even there was some disagreement amongst the reviewers on how to apply this. So
Yes,
just as an
there was.
illustration
I know
of
for
how
a
different.
fact there was because I had these debates with different people from the commission, and it's a very difficult task for such a huge commission. I get that, but
Yeah. And the good thing
anyways,
is, what I will say is that you can see the sensitivity analyses in our paper. Some of these things don't end up changing the final answer that much
Mhm.
because, of course, the clinical diagnosis was rarely driven by the liver in the absence of something else.
Right.
So really, if we modified the definition, it didn't change too much. But
Sure.
it's still a cautionary tale to if you're going to take this to clinical practice, you need to be clear on how to apply such a definition.
Mhm.
And I guess that is the inherent challenge of moving from something simple like BMI to something complicated, even though conceptually interesting like this. So anyway, if you're absolutely pointing at some of the challenges as a researcher, but I think as a I don't know a clinician or policymaker
Mhm.
when thinking about this definition.
So let's just go over I mean, the graph is beautiful. You kind of show the results here, and what it shows to me is what I see in clinical practice is that we aren't seeing too many NFL linebackers coming through who have a high BMI that don't have at least preclinical obesity, and many of them have clinical obesity. So, what were you surprised by any of these results? You can kind of give a quick overview of like the different
Yeah,
classifications.
kind of lay it out from the top to bottom.
Yeah, I would say that the things got very interesting if you look at the crosstab between the WHO obesity definition with the new definition. Especially in the new definition, there's no overweight, which we think is is very astonishing to see. Actually, the overweight group has been categorized into, I mean, has been fitted into three groups: non-obesity or preclinical or clinical obesity. And actually, the proportion of that, which is about each of them, is just one third of it, of the overweight. So it's kind of got me thinking of for the overweight people, uh, for the overweight patient for a long time, what we miss there. Or if there is some people that they are overweight, but they're kind of healthily overweight, so we're kind of too worried about people sometimes. So yeah, definitely some very interesting point to discuss there. But at the same time, we look at our crosstab and figure one panel B about how class one and class two, class three obesity, according to the WHO criteria, how it well captured all those new definition of obesity. I think is also a great start point to think about if we're gonna implement this new definition one in the clinical practice, it actually won't change much about what has already been defined as obesity. But what we really have to think about is actually the overweight part. That's where one third of people turn into clinical obesity and one third of them turn into clinical obesity. So we should actually probably just, at least from my personal perspective, I think we should shift the attention more to the overweight group.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which
so so the 25 to just under 30 kilograms per meter squared for BMI, and then you've looked at the other waist circumference and those other things. So yeah, I mean, we all see these types of patients in the clinic where they're. This is why I get mad at the FDA labeling guidance for like GLP-1s, because I'll have a patient with a 26 BMI who's much unhealthier than some of my even 35 BMI patients.
Yeah, this is a great point. And you'll notice that if you look at figure one as well, there's also some people who have a BMI that's 25 or less who get moved into the preclinical and clinical
Yeah.
based. We didn't delve into it too deeply in this paper, but presumably we've got enrichment and probably some South Asians and other East
Right.
Asians who had a lower BMI manifest visceral adiposity. So this is this. I think Dr. Yao is right. This is where it flips things on its head a little bit, saying, well, it's really changing the paradigm from obesity. I mean, excuse me, from adiposity or visceral adiposity to visceral adiposity from just an overall measure of basically weight. So that's where it really gets interesting. And actually, in the supplements, we have some other kind of deep dives into a few of these groups.
So
Yeah.
where did the waist circumference extra anthropometric things come into play? Because I am only looking at your figure one, that has kind of the BMI classifications, normal weight, overweight, et cetera. But what about the people? So let's say that normal weight category. My suspicion is that those 11% each with preclinical obesity, they must be the people that had elevated
Yeah.
waist circumference measurements to even get into the preclinical obesity, right? And then 11% had probably those measurements, I'll
So
bet you, plus the clinical criteria.
actually, you know what? And it would be cool to do an ethnicity breakdown. Are those is that
Yeah.
an Asian population? What's going on there? Or like that would be really interesting. So nobody can see the graph. I mean, it'd be cool if we could throw it on.
Well, we'll put it on when we share it.
The link will be in here. You can look at the cool graph that they put up. But 11% of people that have a BMI of less than 25, they have not only, well, 11% have preclinical, meaning they have excess fat tissue that's not causing harm based on the definitions. But then about 11% also have enough adiposity or fat tissue that's causing harm. That's a very high, I would say
Right.
that's a pretty high percentage.
And also, I'll bet you Dr. Blaha might appreciate this as kind of looking at all these data for over the years that I've been involved with this stuff. It's always the thinner people. So this gets into sarcopenic obesity too, that we could throw in there. The thinner people with abdominal adiposity and more severe cardiometabolic risk, who have the most severe cardiometabolic risk oftentimes for all these things we're talking about.
Like I said, tricky patients to manage clinically because of the sarcopenia.
Yeah. And I know you don't know much about CAC or anything like that, but
This guy doesn't.
Yeah. But I want to point out, I guess, just to the listeners, because I alluded to it, but we didn't talk about it too much, is what data set we're talking about here. Because this is important. So, and I'll have Dr. Yao comment further, but what we're using is called the All of Us Research Program. You guys, I'm sure, are familiar with All of Us, but maybe not everyone listening would be. So All of Us is a effort that came out of the Precision Medicine Initiative that was something that came out of the Obama administration. And one element of that was to start what's called the All of Us Research Program, which is basically an effort to enroll up to 1 million or over 1 million just people, patients and people who could either sign up from their clinics or just sign up on their own or sign up online. You guys could sign up. And you could join one of 3 tiers of data. You could fill out all the surveys and get the measurements done, you could grant access to your EHR data, or 3, you could give genetic material. So really what we're talking about here is we're using large quantities of data from the All of Us research program of people who committed to giving their EHR data as well. Because, of course, we needed the EHR data too. So this is from several 100,000 people, I guess 250,000 people from the All of Us research program, once again, who have actual physical measurements, all the anthropomorphics. That's important.
Mhm.
They should have physical measurements, but much of the rest comes from the EHR. So we actually know what was diagnosed. Do they have a diagnosis of fatty liver disease at baseline, or do they develop for other projects a diagnosis over time? And really, and only that, there's physical functioning questionnaires and things like that. If you were to think about other data sets, there's very few other places to get and try to calculate this. You need to have diagnoses, physical measurements of anthropomorphics, questionnaires that cover physical activity. So even if you think about some of the data sets we tend to use, Framingham Heart Study, the MESA study, which is the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, you really can't do this actually in those data sets. You need something like All of Us. So just for those of you out there, where this data comes from, it comes from the All of Us research program, which we think is broadly, but not exactly, but broadly representative of the U.S.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it can be really difficult to get all the waist to hip, waist to height, and all those different things accurately. So
Yeah, not many people are doing those things, to be honest. That's impressive in
That's
its
right.
own right.
It's pretty special, yeah.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you're also you're completely depending upon clinicians' diagnostic codes put in, right? Right. So like,
in some issues.
and I'm kind of looking right. So I'm, for example, I'm looking at your those graphs in B where it has the breakdown of say in the class 3 BMI category, 29% were listed as preclinical obesity, which, based on what I know, I find that very hard to believe that 29% of people with a BMI of over 40 have zero obesity related diseases. And this gets back to not only my skepticism of some of the the nuanced criteria from the Lancet Commission, but then also, of course, that's just a difficulty from the data set, perhaps, with relying on diagnostic codes. Is that fair?
Yeah, because this is more like, because we just extracted those diagnoses from the EHR data. It's more like a real world practice. Like if you're going to the real world, that's the data you would say. And but we're definitely welcome any more, like if they have more adjudicated outcomes that can replicate this analysis. We're very excited and welcome to see those results and compare what's the difference with the variation between
Yeah.
a real world data set and a well designed cohort study.
But
So
you could imagine how difficult it would be, right? Of course, there's no data sets where every 300,000 people got a sleep study, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or 300,000 people got a liver ultrasound or things. So this does get very tricky. Yeah. So anyway, these are all things that we did think about and discuss. But you're right. There's absolutely a bias towards what was evaluated in the patient. And now in all of us, everyone has some access to care. But you can imagine if you didn't have as much access to healthcare, you're much less likely to get your sleep apnea diagnosed, for example. So clearly, I think if one were to do testing on everyone, that the number of clinical obesity would go up. But like Dr. Yao said, this is actually a snapshot of real world data. If we were to try, let's say, if we were to proportion drugs this way, or if we were to write guidelines based on these, this is what the real world would look like in terms of if you use real data and try to put people into these groups.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Thank you so much for coming on and discussing. I just think it's a really cool. Again, I've never seen it laid out this way. I don't think I'm sure there'd be a few other. I don't
Well,
even know if
hopefully,
we have to find a cohort like you said. All of us is pretty nice. So have to find other. And you guys are the epi experts.
Yeah, so I want to put a plug in real quick. So I'll just tell a quick story about this paper really quick, which is that this was actually a much longer paper at first, but because of a variety of things, they asked us to make this into a brief report. So we actually had to take out some things in this paper that we'll publish separately. But I will say we have some of the obvious questions you might have. What we certainly had is, well, over time, what percent of people that are preclinical transition to clinical? We have that didn't make it into this paper. We'll be
That's so
now.
cool.
And then also the question of the metabolically healthy obesity, you might be saying, well, what's the cardiovascular risk of these groups?
Yeah.
Was there an elevated cardiovascular risk in the preclinical obesity? Well, we had that in the paper too. That got cut and will be a separate paper. But that gets at this thing. And one thing I'll say is the preclinical obesity group doesn't have as high as risk as you'd imagine, but transitions to clinical obesity at a very high rate.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
challenges the implementation of these in the real world. So we'll send you those papers when they get published.
I
Yeah.
love it.
And I'm sure you're inviting everyone over to Johns Hopkins to get their coronary artery calcium scores.
Yeah, come on over. We'll do it for free.
Very good. Thank you two for coming on so much. Obviously follow both of them on Twitter. I'm going to put their little links in our show notes. Anything else, Casey?
No, just outstanding work. Thanks for being the first ones to really put in the effort and teasing some of this stuff out. And hopefully there will be a lot more. And I guess we'll see how it coincides with our ACE staging of clinical obesity that should be out coming up soon. So appreciate it. Yeah.
Very good. Here's our outro.
Thank you.
Thank you.